So, Ani, Nimkiba Nashinwe Kwaidijnakas, Wikumkong Donjaba, Gigun Dodem. Good afternoon. My English name is Rachel Arsenault, and I'm Anishinaabe Kwe from Wikwamkong Unceded First Nation on Manitoulin Island. Today, I will be presenting on water inequality and the need to address water insecurity in First Nations communities. This will include a discussion on past interventions and the critical need for Indigenous water governance. So in November 2015, I decided to apply for the Masters of Indigenous Relations program at Laurentian University. And while I knew there were a lot of potential environmental studies projects that I could work on involving First Nations, I also knew that water insecurity was one of the more critical issues. So at the time, I was working for the Chiefs of Ontario political office in Toronto, and I'd heard on several occasions from both the Director of the Environment, Kathleen Padullo, and the Indigenous youth that I was fortunate enough to work with, that water insecurity was a very critical issue affecting First Nations in Ontario. And before I finished my application, I sat down with Kathleen and she confirmed that water was something that I should definitely look into. And when I began the research on water insecurity affecting First Nations, I learned a lot about the Indigenous relationships to water and how many Indigenous cultures across Ontario and Canada and the US as well share similar cultural beliefs, protocols, and values around water. In addition, before I completed my degree, I also learned that many Indigenous cultural beliefs, protocols, and values around water and our relationships with water are global. Many of you have probably heard of the Maori in New Zealand establishing personhood status for water so that water protection and conservation became a right for the water itself. And this didn't stop with water. There are a few Indigenous nations around the world that are seeking personhood rights for their environments in general. And while I completed my master's in December 2020, my work with water will not stop, has not and will not stop there. And I understood when I started working with water that I have a responsibility and I'm accountable to not only those Indigenous peoples that have shared their knowledge with me, people like Kathleen Padullo, Rhonda Gagnon, Mike McKay, and several youth knowledge keepers and chiefs and counselors, but I'm also responsible as an Anishinaabe Kwe to keep speaking for the water so that water is respected, protected, and conserved for us present generations, for future generations, for the animals and plants that also rely on water. And in addition, I am accountable to and for the water itself. My earliest teachings and research on water have not only shown me that water is a sacred gift and we owe it not only to our ancestors who respected and conserved water before us to protect it, but as I mentioned, we owe it to future generations, all life itself, and the Creator as well, to find ways to protect water and keep it safe from overuse, contamination, and any other threats. Currently, I am a PhD student at York University, and I'm just entering my third year of studies with the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change. And the focus of my PhD research, which in all honesty is just getting underway, is learning how I can support Indigenous-led and Indigenous-driven solutions to climate change. To do this, I'm going to learn all I can about what Indigenous climate change governance is and how this can be leveraged to assist Indigenous communities with building their resilience to the impacts from climate change. I'm still deeply interested in continuing research on water insecurity and how climate change is exacerbating the existing effects of the water crisis on First Nations communities, which Serge mentioned in the opening comments. So in Indigenous cultures, we start off conversations about who we are and where we come from and what we do. So it's natural for us to situate ourselves in our work. In addition to what I've already shared, I also sit on two boards as a director. I am on the board of the Directors for Water for People Canada, and I'm also on the board of directors for the Réseau Centre for Mobilizing Innovation. And I was invited to sit on the second board by Irving LeBlanc, who is the Director of Infrastructure for the Assembly of First Nations, and Sue Chiblo, who I used to work for at the Chiefs of Ontario political office in Toronto. I am also on the Canadian Environmental Law Association's Advisory Committee for the Healthy Great Lakes program. And as Serge mentioned, I work as an associate for Courage, which is a binational consulting firm. To begin, I'm not sure how many of you are aware of the impacts of the First Nations water crisis in Canada and how this impacts First Nations communities. But I just want to let you all know that I never really thought about it myself, even though I saw all the signs of water insecurity in my own community when I was growing up. For example, my grandfather did not have running water until I was 7. And once he finally had running water, it was trucked to his home. It was also trucked to one of my aunt's place and my cousin's home. And decades later, it is still being trucked to homes in the part of Wiki called Caboni, which is where my family's from, as well as other outlying communities on the reserve. And I never really thought about it until I heard Indigenous youth speak up from other First Nations communities, which I had also previously mentioned. All right. So I took this quote from the Environmental Assessment Toolkit that the Chiefs of Ontario had established in 2007. And throughout the toolkit, they have infused creation stories from both the Cree and Ojibwe to set the tone for cultural priorities, practices, and protocols that the toolkit speaks to. And when I began my research, I realized that it's a common practice for us to start off discussions with creation stories or even include Indigenous stories or storytelling in our research. This helps us to set the tone for our research and reminds us to about our connections to our ancestors who respected, protected, and conserved the waterways before us so we would have the same access to water that they did. This also reminds us that water is a sacred gift, which was given to us by the Creator, and as a result, we have an inherent caretaking responsibility for water, and we need to ensure that we respect, protect, and conserve water for present and future generations, just like our ancestors did before us, as I also mentioned in my opening slide. So this excerpt is from the Ojibwe creation story that was shared in the toolkit by the Chiefs of Ontario that I was just speaking about. And I quote, "Earth is said to be a woman. In this way, it is understood that woman preceded man on the earth. She is called Mother Earth because from her come all living things. Water is her lifeblood. It flows through her, nourishes her, and purifies her." End quote. As you can see from the language in our creation story, we view water as the life force of Mother Earth, and we understand how interconnected water is to everything in our environments. We also understand how water is connected to life. We need water to bathe, we need water to grow food, and we also need water to drink. And as I will explain later on in my presentation, water is also connected to the mental health of Indigenous peoples, as well as the social impacts that water insecurity has on us. So in Anishinaabe, which is the name of the Ojibwe language in our language, we call Mother Earth Shkapmakwe, and we call water Nibe. As people, we all rely on Shkapmakwe for nourishment as well as Nibe. We cannot live without either, and we cannot live healthy lives if Shkapmakwe and Nibe are not also healthy. Within Indigenous cultures across Canada, it is acknowledged and understood that water is life. As I mentioned in my opening comments, I began learning about the First Nations water crisis in 2014 after hearing 2 Indigenous youth speak up about the challenges in their communities. And as some of you may already be aware, this map shows the First Nations that the provincial government had prioritized for eliminating long-term boil water advisories back in 2016. And this followed the federal government prioritizing this initiative in 2015, of which their list of First Nations communities to prioritize for ending long-term drinking water advisories seemed to grow quicker than the government's ability to eliminate these advisories. And I remember this list going from the 90 water systems in the 40 communities shown here to over 100 water systems in First Nations throughout the province. The blue dots on this map show the 37 communities that had boil water advisories and the 3 communities that had do not consume advisories in 2016. And one thing that I need to mention right now is this map does not include every First Nation in Ontario that was experiencing water insecurity during this time frame. This map only shows the communities which were being prioritized by the province. Serpent River, a community that I will speak more about later, is not on this map, and they had serious drinking water challenges in that community until 2017. And as I discussed a few moments ago, First Nations across Canada and Ontario have a special connection and relationship with water. In 2008, many First Nations in Ontario came together to create a water declaration, which describes the numerous Indigenous perspectives on water as well as Indigenous values, priorities, and protocols as they relate to water. Our relationship to water, however, has deteriorated significantly over the past 100 years as extractive development progressed, and this has also led to water insecurity in many First Nations throughout Ontario. The province with the highest number of boil water advisories in First Nations was determined to be Ontario in 2016. And as I just mentioned, after the federal government was elected in 2015, they prioritized the elimination of long-term boil water advisories in First Nations and said that they would complete this work by 2021. I will get more into this later, but we all know that it didn't quite pan out that way. So this
Rachel,
map was, yep.
Sorry to cut you off. Just everybody that's listening, so your slides are not synced up with theirs, and unfortunately, we have to press like the side arrows to switch the slides. So could you just let us know when you're switching the slide, and then everybody will do it manually. I'm not sure how to correct it, but that seems to be the case at the moment.
Okay, because I'm on the introduction slide right now, so that's slide 2.
Oh, okay.
Thank you for pointing that out.
Okay. Yeah, sorry about that.
That's all right. Thank you for letting me know. So this map was created by Leo Lariviere in June 2020, and he was a technician for Laurentian University at that time when they still had a geography department. I also wanted to quickly state that this map is used with permission. The boil water advisories are the blue tabs, and the red tabs are do not consume advisories. Numerous studies, reports, and assessments had been conducted by both levels of government, various consultants, and numerous Indigenous and non-Indigenous organizations. These studies and reports have highlighted the issues, established various committees, and implemented various strategies with billions of dollars in investments and resources dedicated to solving the water crisis. However, despite all of that, we all know that the First Nations water crisis in Canada still persists to this day. And I will provide some updates of the progress from the Indigenous Services Canada, the Assembly of First Nations, and I'll also speak a little bit about the class action lawsuit that some of you may or may not have heard about as I continue to go through the presentation. All right, so I am going to move to the next slide, which is a timeline of water insecurity impacts, reports, and legislation affecting First Nations in Ontario from 1919 to 2008. So I put this timeline together for my master's thesis, which, as I mentioned, I completed my master's in December 2020. And over the past century, and I will get into this in more detail, the Indigenous relationship to water has deteriorated significantly as extractive development projects began to divert and contaminate Indigenous community water sources. And one of the most affected provinces, which I mentioned previously, with the highest number of boil water advisories in First Nations communities is Ontario. There are many First Nations communities that have been impacted by water insecurity over the past few decades, but there are 3 that had received a lot of media attention as well as interest from researchers and scientists due to the severity of their water insecurity. And these 3 communities are Shoal Lake, Grassy Narrows, and Nisga'a First Nation. So Shoal Lake has a long history of water insecurity, which began over a century ago. So in 1919, which is where this timeline begins, the Shoal Lake Peninsula was cut off from the mainland and became a man-made island to create an aqueduct for the city of Winnipeg. And for the decades that followed, the community was further isolated because it was not connected to the Trans-Canada Highway and was also only accessible by boat. So these remote conditions made the building of critical community infrastructure such as water treatment plants and schools next to impossible. And construction on Shoal Lake's essential infrastructure was severely limited until Freedom Road was built and connected the community to the Trans-Canada Highway in 2019. So this is one of the communities that I'm referring to when I say there's over 100 years of water insecurity for some communities. So it took 100 years, the reparations for the environmental impacts that this community suffered on behalf of a provincial government, which is Manitoba. So Grassy Narrows is a community like Shoal Lake, which is also near the Ontario and Manitoba border. And on the map that I just showed you on the previous slide, it was listed as a community which has a do not consume advisory. And that's because in the 1960s, a pulp and paper mill leaked mercury into the English Wabigoon water system, which the community not only relied on for drinking water, but also for sustenance, as the community heavily relied on the fish from this water system for food and for their cultural economy. For those of you not familiar with the effects of mercury contamination, it not only spreads throughout your own body, but it spreads to unborn children when they are developing as a fetus. So pregnant women from this community, which ate tainted fish, spread mercury poisoning to their children. And this is a direct example of environmental racism because the Canadian environment since the 1960s was aware of how bad the contamination was in this community and also lied to the community about the water or the fish being safe to consume. So Japanese scientists heard about this community being affected by Minamata disease, which is caused by mercury poisoning, and did studies starting in the 1970s about how the contamination in their waterways was affecting the health of Indigenous peoples. And for decades, the government still failed to act. The Liberal government, which at the last point of research that I did on this, had reacted to this and pledged to help, but it would and will take millions of dollars to clean up this the English Wabagoon water system. And that is about all I have for updates on that. What I can tell you, though, is that this is an important part of Canadian history when it comes to water insecurity. And more recently, in the fall of 2020, the community of Niskandiga began posting videos documenting their experiences after an oily substance was found in their treated drinking water supply. Excuse me. And by early December 2020, the community had been evacuated for over 40 days, and the count on the number of days continued to rise. They have since returned to their community, but the community is still under a drinking water advisory. And the community holds the record for the longest standing boil water advisory, which has lasted over 27 consecutive years. And Make It Safe, Human Rights Watch made the following statement regarding Shoal Lake and Niskandiga, and I quote, "In communities like Niskandiga and Shoal Lake First Nations, where advisories have existed for approximately 20 years each, a whole generation of children grew up unable to drink the water from the taps. Individuals from this generation are starting to have their own children and to despair," end quote. I checked on the Indigenous Services website to track the progress on Niskandiga before speaking with you all today, and it is still listed as being under a long-term drinking water advisory, but is also categorized as under construction. And unfortunately, water contamination and boil water advisories have not been the only source of water insecurity for First Nations. So the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory has an existing water treatment plant, but they have been struggling with water insecurity for years, despite having a fully functioning water treatment plant. So the water treatment plant in Six Nations had been operating at maximum capacity for several years, with many community members still reliant on individual well systems or water trucks to deliver water to their homes. And while facing water insecurity within the community, Six Nations had also struggled to keep water bottling companies like Nestle from over-extracting water from the Grand River, which is still, the source of the community's water. Another community which stated that they only had partial access to clean drinking water is Batchewana First Nation, located near Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. So part of Batchewana is connected to a municipal water system, but the community could not increase the number of homes it connected to the system because of the existing water use agreement. And according to Human Rights Watch, the community had reached the maximum number of homes which could be connected to the system by 2015. And the remaining homes in the community are reliant on individual well water systems, which Indigenous Northern Affairs Canada, which is what it was called at the time, did not fund. So this left the cost of repairing the systems up to the First Nations reliant on these water systems, which many community members or community bands cannot afford. Human Rights Watch reported in 2016 that many individual well systems have fallen into disrepair as a result. And I wanted to mention these communities because individuals from both Six Nations and Batchewana participated in my master's thesis research. So I wanted to share a bit about the research that Human Rights Watch reported from these communities, as well as some of the findings from my own research initiative, which were confirmed by those participating individuals. And when I did a quick search of the short-term drinking water advisories listed on the Indigenous Services website before speaking with you all today, the Gule community, which is a part of the Batchewana Reserve, was listed as having a short-term drinking water advisory in April of this year, so about 3 or 4 months ago. So I already discussed the years 1919 and 1916, which are on this timeline, but I'll also discuss why 1968 is on there. So in 1968, the federal government created guidelines for Canadian drinking water quality, which set out the maximum acceptable concentrations of microbial, chemical, and radiological contaminants, as well as providing technical guidance on treatment. And from 1990 to 1999, it was determined that substandard water treatment systems had been built in First Nations communities, and this practice continued until 1999. Walkerton is also on this timeline, and I just wanted to quickly note that this non-Indigenous community, an infamous one for the province of Ontario, had their water crisis resolved within 6 months of their E. coli outbreak, along with a full inquiry into the events leading up to this crisis. And this has never been the case with any water insecurity challenges in First Nations communities. So Maryland Fair, Deborah McGregor, and Human Rights Watch have critically assessed why government interventions, legislation, and investments have largely failed over the past decade. In 2009, Fair determined there were two key flaws in government initiatives and investments. One, there was a lack of legislation protecting drinking water in First Nations communities, and two, only 67% of the funding invested by the government into drinking water in First Nations was received by the communities. The remaining 33% of the government funding and investments went to government staff and other administrative requirements for implementing safe drinking water in First Nations communities. And Fair stated that her findings were based off of reports by the Assembly of First Nations. By 2014, Deborah McGregor had also compiled a list of government assessments, reports, investments, and legislation in her article, The Ethic of Responsibility. And she found that Indian and Northern Affairs Canada had discovered some alarming statistics with their 2003 National Assessment of Water and Wastewater Systems. So out of the 740 water systems that the government had assessed at that time, 29% posed potentially high risks to water quality, 46% were medium risks, and less than a quarter of the water systems posed low or no risks to First Nations water quality. 3 years later, in 2006, Indian and Northern Affairs Canada announced an action plan for drinking water in First Nations communities. This action plan called for the establishment of an expert panel, which was to advise on a regulatory framework for securing safe drinking water in First Nations communities. The expert panel presented three options for a regulatory framework in their final report. One was creating new regulations which were supported by existing legislation. Two was the establishment of federal drinking water quality standards for First Nations communities. And three was enabling First Nations to include their own laws in new regulations. So Fair, McGregor, and Human Rights Watch indicated that these recommendations were also lacking because they did not mention the need for sufficient funding and resources which are required to implement these options. In 2005, the Assembly of First Nations conducted a study which found that First Nations were receiving less than half of what municipalities were receiving for their capital infrastructure. And the same study found that many First Nations communities could not keep up with the operations and maintenance required for their water systems, especially communities in northern, rural, and remote areas where the associated costs were much higher. So despite millions of dollars in investments from 2003 to 2008, critical water security challenges remained in First Nations communities, and I'm going to move to the next slide, which is the second half of the timeline. So in 2010, the federal government initiated a legislative process to regulate drinking water in First Nations. Federal engagement and consultation with First Nations were limited, and in 2013, the Safe Drinking Water for First Nations Act, also called the SWFNA, was enacted. First Nations heavily criticized the act because the legislation did not reflect their core concerns and therefore failed to address Indigenous water insecurity in First Nations. While the act succeeded in establishing regulatory components for safe drinking water in First Nations, it also absolved the federal government of all responsibility for providing safe drinking water in communities and placed this burden on First Nations chiefs and leadership instead. The legislation also failed to mention where the necessary funding and resources required to establish and maintain safe drinking water in First Nations would come from. The issues found within the legislation were a direct result of the government failure to engage and consult with First Nations prior to the legislation being established. In Make It Safe, Human Rights Watch discussed a 2011 report by Indian and Northern Affairs Canada, which found that between 20 and 25% of water and wastewater systems in First Nations were operating at capacity or beyond. The Indian and Northern Affairs Canada report also stated that only 69% of First Nations households had access to piped water, while the remaining 31% relied on individual wells, trucked water, or had no water service at all. By 2015, assessments conducted on First Nations water needs found that there was insufficient funding to address the infrastructure needs in communities and that First Nations had difficulties operating their systems without adequate funding and resources. As the government only provided a maximum of 80% of the funding required to operate and maintain water and wastewater systems on reserve, First Nations were left paying for the remaining 20% needed to cover their water and wastewater needs. There was also a 2% cap on increased funding for their water and wastewater systems, which meant that inflation and population growth had not been factored into the funding allocations. This significantly impacted population growth and housing needs in First Nations communities. And Human Rights Watch also stated that $4.7 billion in investments was required to bring First Nations community infrastructure up to Canadian standards. And again, this was in 2016, so I don't know if that number still applies or if it could be much higher now because of inflation. So by the year 2016, linkages between water insecurity and the health, education, social, and justice issues within Indigenous communities began being identified. It was determined that water insecurity made the Indigenous peoples affected by it more vulnerable than the rest of the Canadian population that had access to clean drinking water. Additionally, there were direct links to water insecurity found within the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls inquiry conducted by the Ontario Ministry of the Solicitor General. Water insecurity was also linked to the untimely deaths of 7 Indigenous youth who had died under mysterious circumstances in the Thunder Bay area in Ontario. And following the inquiry into the deaths of the 7 youth, it was determined that the mental and social health was impacted by water insecurity in their First Nations communities, or that their, mental and social health. The conclusions from both inquiries found that First Nations communities require sustainable funding and resources to meet their water security needs. So I am aware that the Assembly of First Nations has been working with the 633 First Nations in Canada on repealing the Safe Drinking Water for First Nations Act. However, the only updated information that I was able to find on this initiative before speaking with you today was a water sector update from June of last year, which was in 2021. And in this sector update, and I quote, the AFN stated, one moment here. As of April 9th, 2021, there remains 52 long-term drinking water advisories in effect in 33 First Nations communities. To date, Indigenous and Services Canada confirms that 106 long-term advisories have been lifted since November 2015. However, this report number only includes Indigenous Services Canada funded assets and systems with 5 connections or more. They do not include the many First Nations on individual wells or cisterns. These numbers also do not include many advisories in British Columbia and those within the Saskatoon Tribal Council. End quote. The AFN sector also discussed an action plan which was put forward by Indigenous Services Canada, which was based on a set of recommendations from the Office of the Auditors General's report. Also on this timeline was the 2015 commitment by the federal government to end all long-term drinking water advisories in First Nations by 2021. However, Indigenous Services Canada, ISC, announced that this initiative was put on hold towards the end of 2020 because the COVID-19 pandemic had caused too many delays with the water system projects. In early December 2020, the Anishinaabe Nation released a statement on how the ISC delay in eliminating the long-term boil water advisories would impact 11 First Nations as well as 4 communities on short-term drinking water advisories in their region alone. And when I checked the Indigenous Services Canada website for their new timeline on when the long-term drinking water advisories would be resolved by, I could not find a date. However, I did find this information within the AFN sector update that I was just discussing. So the AFN sector update states that the new ISC deadline for resolving long-term drinking water advisories in First Nations is now by 2023. And the AFN update also states, and I quote, ISC will not will work with First Nations to implement and ensure that long-term solutions for sustainable access to potable water are in place in all First Nations that have been affected by long-term drinking water advisories by fiscal year 2025 to 2026, end quote. So the AFN received this information in the aforementioned ISK action plan. And finally, what I have not yet mentioned on this timeline is the class action lawsuit, which was launched in 2019 by Niskandiga and Curve Lake First Nations. And by July 2021, the communities involved had reached a settlement worth $8 billion with the federal government. And in a CBC News release from March of this year, they reported that communities have until December of this year to file claims under the settlement, while individuals have until March 2023. All right, so I'm going to move on to the next slide, which is Indigenous research part again. So there are existing documents, which I mentioned, such as the Water Declaration, which outline Indigenous priorities, values, and relationships with water that can be used to inform all initiatives and decision-making processes. So I did talk about the Water Declaration on my third slide, and there is also a provincial water declaration for the province of Ontario and a national water declaration for Indigenous communities across Canada as well. Because when it comes to water, there are a lot of priorities and values that Indigenous peoples across this country share. So Article 37 of the Ontario Water Declaration reads, and I quote, "First Nations in Ontario have the authority and responsibility as given to us by the Creator. We are going to assert our authority. We have legal rights recognized by the laws given to us by the Creator, the Constitution of Canada, and international law," end quote. So I want to share these concepts and this quote from the Declaration with you to describe and explain the Indigenous relationships to water. As I stated earlier, when water insecurity impacts Indigenous communities, it doesn't just impact us physically, but socially and mentally as well. So Indigenous peoples have different forms of their own knowledge systems, commonly called traditional knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, and Indigenous knowledge systems that they apply to water governance and decision-making processes. So many Indigenous peoples across Ontario have their own laws and natural laws that they abide by, and these laws supersede Canadian laws because they have been passed down from their ancestors and were created based on their connection to the Creator, current generations, and the next 7 generations that will follow. And these laws pertain to the land and waters and govern Indigenous interactions with both. When I did my master's research, I came across these 4 principles, which were shared by Indigenous researchers from all over the world. I am sure many of you understand what posterity means. This is ensuring that present and future generations are taken into consideration. This principle, however, goes much deeper for Indigenous peoples because we understand that our ancestors lived their lives in a sustainable way so that we would have the same access to clean air, clean and replenishable water sources, and uncontaminated land that they did. So I heard a quote once, which was shared by an Indigenous individual from the Philippines. And while I understand that she in turn got this quote from someone herself, I unfortunately did not have the time to find the original source. And that quote is, "We do not own the land, we borrowed it from our children." And this quote explains so much about why Indigenous peoples are seen as stewards and caretakers of the environment and resources that we all share. In terms of relational accountability, as Indigenous peoples, we have a sacred responsibility to all our relations and to protect the gifts that have been given to us in the form of air, land, and resources. This includes water. Also, for those of us who are Indigenous researchers, we also have a responsibility to both our Indigenous nations and to any Indigenous nations that we aim to support and assist. So for those of you who are familiar with Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, she talks about this in her book, Indigenous Research Methodologies, and the same can be said for the Indigenous peoples that I've worked with throughout my career. So as an Indigenous Kwe and as an Anishinaabe Kwe, I owe it not only to my own nations, but all peoples from every nation that shared their knowledge with me in perpetuity until the First Nations water crisis is resolved and until there are no more water insecurity challenges in First Nations communities in general. And it's unfortunate to say and more unfortunate to understand, but I fear this will likely not happen in my lifetime for many reasons, which I've already discussed and will continue to discuss. In terms of reciprocity, researchers have a responsibility to ensure that Indigenous knowledge shared by the Indigenous peoples is understood from their frames of reference, as well as ensuring that the same emphasis is placed on Indigenous knowledge as well as Western knowledge. Some of you may have heard of two-eyed seeing, which is a practice that Elder Albert Marshall came up with from the East Coast. And this is a direct example of reciprocity in action. So Indigenous peoples from many nations have always understood that they have relevant knowledge to share, which can enhance and strengthen not only Western knowledge systems, but also Western laws, which I will get into in more detail. So finally, there is a need to create transformative research. This means that research must be flexible, adaptable, and transformative. Research must also acknowledge the uniqueness of cultures, geographic areas, and social and political backgrounds to provide recommendations and solutions which can be adapted and tailored to specific community needs. So this is what is missing from many attempts to both resolve the water crisis as well as the attempts to resolve many of the challenges that Indigenous communities are facing. There was another quote that I heard, which is, "Nothing about us without us." And again, my apologies because I could not tell you who coined that phrase. But this includes creating research which can contend with colonial and capitalist-centered intellectualism while promoting the necessity and strengths of Indigenous intellectualism. Okay, I'll move on to the next slide. So I also wanted to talk about John Burroughs, who's an Indigenous lawyer and a famous one from the Chippewas of Nawash. And when I checked the Indigenous Services website the other day for updates on where they are in terms of eliminating long-term drinking water advisories, the Chippewas of Nawash was listed as still being under one. So the first article that I ever read from John Burroughs was from 1997, and it's still relevant to this day. And this article was called "Living Between Rocks and Water." And I read this article when I did my first draft contributions to the very first article that I collaborated on with Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers from both Canada and the United States. And in this article, John Burroughs talks about replacing knowledge. And by that, he meant that Western knowledge should adapt from its current practice of putting knowledge into silos to a system which understands and encompasses multiple knowledge systems simultaneously. For example, I'm talking to you all today about water, which is currently discussed as a geographical or environmental study. However, what I'm also telling you is that water is also a social, political, and health and mental health topic. You need to understand how water affects Indigenous people socially, economically, politically, as well as understanding the effects on health, mental health, and food security. So it does not fit within only one Western construct. And John Burroughs understood that and wrote in depth about it. And for that reason, he'll always be one of the most influential Indigenous researchers that I'll always turn to throughout my career. So on this slide, and I quote John Burroughs, he explains that placing Indigenous traditions in an intersocietal context through a culturally appropriate methodology that allows access to oral tradition and community knowledge illustrates how traditional legal knowledge could enhance democracy and facilitate sustainability. Placing Indigenous accounts of law within and beside Western interpretations of contemporary customary law encourage more inclusive democratic conversations, neither separate from nor entirely included within more formal role-based discourses, end quote. And he is one of the very first Indigenous researchers that I came across, which clearly started articulating this. All right, so I'm going to move on to the next slide, which is my thesis results. I'm just going to check for time here. Oh, wow, okay. So
yeah, we'll probably go just until like 12:55. How does that sound?
All right.
Okay.
All right. So I'm just going to talk about some of the results from my master's thesis, and then I'll skip a few slides. So these are what some of the very few Indigenous participants from across Ontario had to say about their water and security challenges. And there are a few maps that I will share, so you get a very good glimpse of where they're all from. And I was very unfortunate to get samples from so many geographical regions within the province. So early in the research, it became clear that different water systems, or a lack thereof, would mean different water security or insecurity experiences for First Nations community members. If they were reliant on well water, did they have challenges with maintenance on their systems? And if their homes had plumbing, did that mean they were connected to a community water supply, or were they still reliant on water trucks? And what kind of wastewater and water systems were the communities using? If they were using lagoons, were they properly maintained, and or did they meet Canadian standards? And if they relied on trucks for water, did they also rely on trucks for septic system removal? I designed the questions for my thesis to flesh all these out, and these are the 10 themes that emerged. So I won't read those out to you because you can see them clearly on the screen. So I'll just quickly scan over. So this was the participating communities from the Anishinaabe nations, where they discussed 9 out of the 10 themes. The Iroquois and Allied Indians talked about, hang on a second here. 5 of the 10 themes. And I only had those 3 communities participate from that region. And then Grand Council Treaty 3, unfortunately, I only had 1 representative from there, but they talked about 4 of the 10 themes. For the independent and unaffiliated communities, they discussed 3 of the 10 themes. And then finally, Anishinaabe Aski Nation talked about 4 of the 10 themes. So this is where they were all from. I'll just quickly show you that, from around the province of Ontario. And I'm going to just skip into my closing remarks once I find where I have them. I did want to share at least a quick update on where everything is at. All right. So I won't get into that. So the picture on the slide was taken outside of Queen's Park during a rally for Grassy Narrows, which I talked about earlier. To conclude, it's clear that water insecurity in First Nations is an overly complex issue with no simple answers. But I do hope that I've offered at least some insights into why. And I'm sure there are more reasons than the ones that I mentioned here today. But there are also some approaches that are successful, and I am confident that there are more on the way. Finally, I wanted to thank the Ontario Water Consortium for inviting me here today, and to all of you for hearing me speak. And please let me know if you have any questions. Just escape here and turn off the PowerPoint.
Thank you so much. Okay, so I guess I'll open the floor for any questions. Oh, wow. Okay, we have 10 minutes. So the way that we'll do it, we're about 30 people. So you can either raise your digital hand and I can unmute you, or you can type your questions in the chat. So I see. Okay. All right, June. I think I just unmuted you.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Rachel. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. I knew you ran out of time, but I think it was worth it understanding where you were coming from. At least I greatly appreciate it, and definitely informing us of your either conceptual or theoretical framework that you were developing. So I also greatly appreciate that. You were mentioning something about water being perceived as a feminine issue or it seemed like a feminine being in First Nations. Would that be true for most First Nations across Canada, or that just happened to be the situation across Ontario? Thank you.
Thank you for your question, June. And I'm glad you brought that up so that I could actually clarify a little bit. So in Indigenous cultures, many of them, Indigenous women are seen as protectors of water. However, Indigenous men still have a very critical role to play in that because their role is to protect women while they're protecting water. So I would say that it's pretty much everybody's responsibility to protect water, not just Indigenous women, but we just have different roles to play, including non-Indigenous people. For example, learning how to, including myself, live more sustainably than we have been is really important and critical for all of us. Thanks, Jane.
Thank you.
Thanks for that question. Okay, so I'll read off a few. The first one is from Florence Udembi, and she asks, how do you suggest to raise awareness regarding the First Nation water issues in non-Indigenous communities, for example, Toronto?
I'm so glad you brought that up, Florence, because that's actually something that really bothers me every time I see a new condo building go up in Toronto. You know, they're tackling their housing problem without tackling their infrastructure problem. So I completely 100% agree with you, and we should be doing that wherever possible. So just to respond to your question, wherever and whenever possible, if you can figure out ways to raise awareness on that, I strongly recommend you do. The only reason why I wanted to tackle the Indigenous water crisis rather than tackling other, I guess, infrastructure problems within the province is just because there's not enough attention about it. There's not enough momentum going about it. I mean, there is momentum, but it's just keeping it going is really important. And I would say the same thing for places like Toronto. So I'm glad you raised that. All right. Are there any other questions?
Yeah. So the next one is from Rhiannon James. And it's, how do you feel the study of groundwater could be used to benefit of addressing water insecurity in First Nation communities?
Thank you for raising that question. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of technical knowledge on groundwater, so I couldn't really give you a good response to that. But I'm sure Indigenous engineers and Indigenous engineers that work with First Nations are probably likely taking that into consideration. So that's unfortunately the only response I can give you. But yeah, thank you for asking that.
So the next question, I really like this one. What is the biggest need in terms of skilled persons to help solve the water crisis? How can individuals get involved to help?
That's a really good question. I think that the way that non-Indigenous allies can really do their part to support Indigenous communities with this is if you have an engineering background, if you have an infrastructure background and the interest and the time, and you see a community in need and they're in need of technical services, you can reach out that way. But I also know of several groups that have tried this as well, and it doesn't always work because of the capacity challenges within First Nations communities. It's not that there's no interest there, it's just that due to capacity and timing constraints, they don't always have the time to respond or even, sometimes even acknowledge that people want to help. It's a really, really tricky situation. And there's a million responses that I could give to that question. But that's just the one that comes to mind first, I guess.
Okay, we'll do one last question and then, I'll so the last question is, what made you want to pursue a PhD? How do you think academia could further incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing?
All right. Thank you for asking that. Honestly, the only reason why I wanted to pursue a PhD is not necessarily, to say that I have this piece of paper and that I made it this far, but actually I just saw when I was done my master's thesis, I just felt like I had more work to do. And climate change was another big issue that is close to my heart that I would love to figure out ways to support. And that definitely factored in. Plus, I was invited to do my PhD research by Dr. Deborah McGregor, who is one of my mentors. And I knew she would help me, and I knew that she would assist me any way she could, and that she would also provide me with really great guidance on things that I should focus on. So that was definitely a motivating factor. There's still a lot of need out there in terms of gaps in Indigenous research. For example, there's not a lot of information on what Indigenous governance looks like in terms of climate change. So that's one thing that I want to help Indigenous peoples flush out any way I can as a researcher. There's just so many things that I want to do and not enough time in the world, but at least I could support with these two issues, because I'm definitely a hardcore environmentalist. So yeah, thanks for asking.
So we just had one small question from June. She was just asking, what's the best way to reach you?
Sure. I could put my email in the chat. Just 1 second here. And you can feel free to use it anytime.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
There it is.
Thank you.
Right? Okay. Yeah, feel free to reach out anytime if you have any questions. If I can't answer them, then I may know who can. So, yeah.
All right. So for closing remarks, thank you everybody for attending our first session for Water Inequality webinar series. We will be having another webinar series in September, so keep an eye out for that. That will be coming out once we finalize the date. We also are hosting a hackathon event, which will be held around October. If you all want to keep up with some of these events, you can subscribe to the newsletter for OWC. We will also be sending out a survey just to ask for any suggestions. And again, I apologize for having to manually change the slides for everybody. I'll make sure to correct that for the next one. So thank you. And thank you so much for Rachel Arsenault and also Florence Udemby that pretty much put all this together. So thanks again, both of you.